Honorable Minister, Dr. Mpango, Minister of Finance and Economic Planning, Dr. Meru, members of the CEO Roundtable, my colleagues from the private sector, representatives of the World Bank, IMF, EU, and other development partners present to invite you to the launching of a book that has been written for the sole purpose of making a contribution to the work of policy making. I would like to thank Dr. Mpango for being here on a day when I understand there is a very important cabinet meeting taking place, and because of that he won't be able to stay for a long time. But his being here, in spite of that challenge, shows the strong dedication he has, not only to his job, but also to the partnership with the private sector. I've known Dr. Philip Mpango long before he joined government as a very, very smart academic, somebody who understands economics. He worked with the World Bank, he taught at universities before joining the government in the Planning Commission. I worked with him on a number of projects in the Planning Commission in the previous phase government, and he can be credited as the main author of the two plans that have been implemented so far. The first 5-year development plan that was implemented up to 2015, and the one that is currently ongoing. And since our book was based primarily on our own critique of the 5-year development plan too, it's very important that we have him here, but it's also very important that he has read the book, formed an opinion which is largely positive, and he's going to be speaking for himself here. I want also to take the opportunity and use this platform to thank all who have supported this work. We would not have the book today had it not been for the material support and the moral support that I received from my colleagues in the CEO Roundtable, especially my board of directors who are here. Ineke Busemaka, who is the CEO of NMB. If you could please stand up so that we can see you. Nehemiah Mchechu, who is the CEO, Director General of National Housing Corporation. Mr. Leonard Mususa, formerly with PwC, currently chairman of very many boards, who was also a member of the CEO Roundtable Board of Directors. And there are others who are not present. Mr. Francis Nanai, member of the board, the CEO of Mananchi Communications, not present here but very supportive, is Mr. Yogesh Manek, the CEO, chairman of Mark Group, Dr. Alex Nguluma, and the now departed dear friend of ours, Nicola Colangelo, who inspired, at least me, to think about putting our ideas down on paper. May God rest his soul in peace, inshallah. He died earlier last month. So there is another very important person I need to thank who's not in this room, who made also, I think, a huge contribution to hopefully its success, and that is His Excellency the President, John Pombe Magufuli, who, upon my request, agreed to pen a foreword for this book. Industrialization, contrary to what a lot of people believe, is not just something you do to make money. It's not something countries do to become wealthy. It's what countries do to become developed. Industries create jobs, and jobs create wealth. Jobs create development. We do not, for example, believe that GDP growth is a very fair metric for measuring development. We think that you need to actually dig deeper and look at GDP per capita growth. Chemical industry being set up in Lindi with $25 billion being invested in the next 10 years, it could easily double the GDP of this country. But 95% of the population of this country may never be connected in any realistic way to that particular economy. Their individual incomes are not going to be impacted in any way. But that is how the economy has been taught to us for a long time. GDP growth, 6% a year, 7% a year, is better than everybody else. Everyone's supposed to be happy. The income, the GDP per capita growth was much, much lower, was in some years even negative. And that explains why, even as our countries grow, we do not get out of poverty as fast as the numbers show or suggest. When we looked at the issue of energy, people measure progress by saying, oh, we had 1,000 megawatt last year, we have 1,400 megawatt this year, we've grown by 40%. That's fantastic. You're going to need much more than that. You're going to need more than 10,000. You're going to need more than 20,000 megawatts of electricity. Look at South Africa. They have 45 times electricity per capita of what we have here. We wanted to make sure that our development plans are realistic, are pragmatic. How long is it going to take? What strategies should we pursue? How much money will it cost? And then you have to factor that into the whole project of industrialization, because at the end of the day, industries are also built by people, regardless of who is in power, regardless of if the opposition takes over, regardless of which personality comes. And we wanted to make sure that this particular government tries to embed these principles of industrialization so that the people of this country commit to this project for the long term. Where will the money come from? Who will provide it? In which ways? And what is going to be the role of the state? We looked at examples of various countries in the world that have successfully industrialized. What did they do? Where did they make mistakes? How did they correct them? What can we learn from them? When for more than 50 years, it was made very difficult to import vehicles into India. You had a 150% tariff. But also Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, for her entire time in office, she rode only in a vehicle called the Ambassador, a very ugly vehicle, but it was made in India. As the president says in his foreword, this is not the beginning and the end of the contributions that should be made to this thing. With that, I would like to conclude my remarks by thanking all of you for coming, by thanking all of you for showing support, by taking interest in this event that's taking place at a very difficult time, but also to say the journey starts today.
The book is indeed an invaluable contribution on the raging debate on how to successfully transform sub-Saharan African countries, and Tanzania in particular, from traditional agriculture-dominated economies into modern industrialized states by 2063. And during that period, we marshaled our brains and talents we could tap into to craft three main documents. The first was the long-term perspective plan, 2011 to 2025. And this was meant to be a comprehensive roadmap to guide thinking and actions, envisaged for Tanzania to be able to achieve the target of becoming a middle-income country by 2025. I personally, and I underline the word personally, I find both the first 5-year development plan and the second 5-year development plan to be suffering from the zeal or over-ambition of attempting to address all economy-wide gaps at once. So if you read the plans, we are dealing with how to deal with poor infrastructure, weak human capital base, low productivity across board, weak political institutions, poor governance, undeveloped financial markets, and so on and so on. This book is therefore not only an excellent complement to the second 5-year development plan, but in fact, it is worth being called Volume 2 of the second 5-year development plan. Well, I wish Ali could have gone further to tell us to what extent should local financing and ownership be diluted. what kind of foreign ownership of industries should be accepted. Once the local financing and ownership are diluted, when and how will these be reversed to benefit the majority of Tanzanians? Besides, I firmly believe that the primary responsibility for the development of Africa rests with Africans. In the book, As Africa's Growth Illusion or Supposed Rise. Much as there is merit in telling aggregate stories, country-specific storylines and dynamics often differ significantly, given the heterogeneity of the continent. The picture painted in the book gives an impression that Africa's growth in the last decade has been largely on account of the commodity boom. The truth is that this is an incomplete picture. In other words, the African growth story has also to do with some signs of structural transformation, not just the commodity boom. I'm not sure how much Africa is currently investing in research in solar energy. Perhaps I'm naive, but I would tend to think harvesting information technology in all spheres is a superior lever for transforming Africa radically in this century. Ladies and gentlemen, with regard to the way forward, I fully concur with the authors when they call for experimenting in 1 or 2 industrial locations or cities before rolling out to the whole nation, and do so in calculated steps over several years. And in my opinion, our starting point in our industrialization journey, or rule of the thumb, should be to direct initial focus on subsectors where there are proven and tested successes, at least in terms of share in the domestic market and penetration into regional markets and beyond. In a particular way, the concept of national exceptionalism expounded in this book is very powerful, akin to the Chinese cultural emancipation. Ladies and gentlemen, let me end by urging my fellow countrymen to read this book. It is a must-read for students, scholars, policymakers, private sector, and friends of Tanzania, as well as those who have a passion to see Tanzania graduate into an industrial. I hope that my colleagues in government, and I'm happy that the Permanent Secretary, Minister of Industries, Trade and Investment is here. So I hope that my colleagues like him will see great merit in this book as I did, and strive to harvest the brilliant ideas therein to inform government future plans and policies. And with these remarks, I am now ready to conduct the official launch of the Tanzania Industrialization Journey 2016-2056, but want to assure you that the resolve of the fifth phase government leadership to industrialize Tanzania is firm. There is no alternative. Let us all put our heads together and make it a dream come true. And to the ARMG team, Ali, Moremi, and your 2 other colleagues, once again I say congratulations, and we wish to remind you that we are eagerly awaiting for your next book. Thank you.
When we're looking at policy and prioritization, the book touches on a number of things in terms of protectionism, economic patriotism, and controlled industrial policy. What are your views in terms of how Tanzania can actually implement that as a priority, and how do we move forward?
I think prioritization is inevitable. If you think at the position we're in, we are a poor country, and with a very ambitious program. I mean, if you look at the election promises, it would be near impossible to implement all that in the time frame that we're talking about. I mean, if that is 5 years to make an impression, then that's near impossible. So, and if you talk about industrialization, and the book outlines the various things that are prerequisite to actually getting industrialization done. And those things will need to be sorted out in the process. So in prioritizing, if you say we're focusing on areas that we can quickly get done, I mean, if you're talking about light industry, for example, and we focus on light industry, facilitated by maybe special zones with infrastructure. There are a lot of challenges on infrastructure, but focusing the infrastructure on areas that we've identified on light industry, setting out the institutional framework, the policy framework in those areas, I think we stand a good chance. We couldn't really imagine that we could do everything. But I think in prioritizing, what we mean, we really need to see what the government can best do. Is it policy framework, institutional framework, infrastructure, sorting out the education side? They can start with those at the earliest possible opportunity. The policy institutional framework is really to lay the ground for attracting private sector. And I think that's the way I see it. The government facilitating in terms of prioritizing its own work, but also prioritizing the policy institutional framework to attract private sector players.
Aidan, I'll come to you next. Do you think in terms of prioritization, in terms of policy implementation, and in terms of putting aside election campaigns, is Tanzania ready to start this journey, as Ali Mfuluki said?
4 things to help with prioritization, right? Number 1, the principle of subsidiarity, which underlies the Maastricht Treaty in the European Union. The principle which suggests that social and political issues, and maybe economic ones, should be dealt with at the most immediate or local level that is consistent with their resolution. So overhauling how we are constituted as a country, and we were supposed to provoke discussion. Should we not elect our regional commissioners and our district commissioners so as to better hold them to account? Can we imagine a strong federal republic of Tanzania and not a united republic of Tanzania? We talk about roadmaps. Roadmaps, they sound really cool. But I would argue for a preference for compasses over maps. You see, a map implies detailed knowledge of the terrain and existence of an optimum path to that destination. The compass is a far more flexible tool and requires the user to employ creativity and autonomy. I like this one personally, but then I'm a parent, maybe I shouldn't like it. A preference for disobedience over compliance, right? Disobedience, especially in problem solving, often pays higher dividends than compliance. Innovation requires creativity, and creativity, to the great frustration of managers, many of us are in here and are managers, often requires freedoms from constraints. So, priority in that future, it's a complicated undertaking.
Aidan, thank you. In terms of implementation of the special economic zones that the EPZA is mandated over, what is your perception of implementing in that manner?
First of all, let me join the rest of you and the Minister to congratulate the the authors. The book's really an outstanding contribution to the industrial development debate, and first time coming outside the government circle or academia. We're used to that. And the writing excellent, the arguments well presented, and so, you know, the authors have labored to do a very good job. Let me start by restating, address what I didn't to say. Say, what, 40 years, 2016, 2056. If Ali had consulted me, I would have said 2066, 50 years. Why? Because if you look at, you know, economic development history through times, you see that industrialization only takes roots when you have intergenerational transfer of skills and knowledge. And so you count one generation as 25 years, the world turns, you know, 50 years, and you have one transfer. And then after 50 years, going to 75, another transfer. And I think it's one reason that because human development and knowledge is cumulative. We go through waves of innovation. You know, I agree with you, the speed is brilliant, but unless the generations keep making use of the labors of the past generation, then you'll always remain in infancy of knowledge because you're starting afresh. I believe the 8 requirements for creating an enabling environment for industrialization should all be done at once, but we don't have the resources to do that countrywide. So if we say we're going to develop Bagamoyo Special Economic Zone, so it's 100 square kilometers that we have demarcated. So we have port, logistics center, industrial city, commercial city, and within that oasis, we create an economic oasis. We put state-of-the-art technology, we put the best environment for industry to take on. And then that becomes a laboratory, and we see. And then we can roll out whatever comes out there. Can we go into each one of them and desegregate and say, you know, for each project, what are the deliverables? You know, what activities do we have? And who can do what amongst us? Who do we need to empower? We will not then be developing policies in boardrooms, in lecture rooms, in meetings, but we'll be formulating policies that go to apply to achieve something.
Please, if you have some questions.
My name is Engineer Dostedit Siva Kakoko. I'm the Director General of the Tanzania Ports Authority. First of all, I would like to thank the authors of the book, which has been launched. But I have 3 questions if I'm to go directly. The first one, I see it is going to be part of next discussion, but it has been touched a little bit by retired economist Bakalia. That is to do with the people-centeredness and the building up from the past experience. Are we sure this building up is going to be, or is it already embedded in our training, education and training policy? Although it will be discussed later, but from the point of view that we have talked, we would like to have it. Looking at China, for example, if you look at the kind of progress they made, even Switzerland, they started with the kitchen sort of factories, family, and in fact low level, even lower than SIDO. And that is what we talk about, the training. You have the school, but you have real training even in the families. Question number 2 is regarding the involvement of government as not only a policymaker, but as a market and as a driver. Do you think it is good that the government can come in wholesomely, or do we have to leave everything to the private? How much should be taken by government? How much should the private sector take? Or how should the partnership be? I'm citing an example when His Excellency the President was making visiting Tanga region, when he told the minister who was mandated with the industries, there was a lot of debate in our social media as to whether now the government was going to take over or what would happen, and there were commentaries. Number three is, how should we start this journey? Should we start with the left leg or right leg? And this one, maybe I have also proposed, we should go and inventorize what is existing. This is as is basis analysis, and probably see how we can come from there. I said, for example, when the president visited the port, in the presentation I made to him, I was talking about how the port as a market can contribute to the industrial journey. I think we need to look into what is the business going on around the enterprises in the country and what is in stock with the industrialists, so that we look if there is a gap and how this relationship can be, instead of being theoretical. I know there will be a market outside, but we need a market inside.
We'll start with you, Colonel Simbakalia, please.
Senator gentleman, answering your question, told about their company, and he said we believed in Nakamura forest. You see, our company, the big company, is a big tree in the forest, but a big tree cannot survive by itself in the forest. It requires, shrubs, grass, and they all form part of that ecology. Yes, and I think this is what Ali was alluding to, that industrialization is not just building factories and it's transformation of society, education system and even the environment and even the games that our kids are going to play in a different environment. There are two very significant differences between now and then, when our founding fathers tried to industrialize. You see, we're trying to industrialize now with an opportunity to catch the third global industrial relocation. You started with Europe, and then it was US, and then came China, and now China is looking to relocate its industry somewhere, and it looks like Africa is the only, or is the best destination. And so we can catch that. And that would answer in great part, and others will come. The policy instruments, the tariff, use of tariff or trade tariff as a policy instrument to protect your industries may not be a policy instrument that's very relevant and applicable now. Why? Because of regional integration. I mean, if you have common external tariff, you cannot say you're going to put a tariff barrier to protect your industry in Tanzania without consulting Kenya, without consulting Uganda, and Rwanda, Burundi. And in our case, because we have got, dual regional citizenship of EAC and SADC, I think the challenge becomes even bigger. So the only way I believe one can protect your industries is to strive for international competitiveness. That's how you start protection, from on domestic market. Then if you can compete outside your borders, surely nobody should be able to beat you inside.
Thank you, Colonel Simbakalia. If I may please ask the panelists just one final comment. Keep it to 1 minute, please. Aidan, I'll start with you.
I think, to build on what Colonel Simbakalia said, we're in a very different world today. So let's internalize that pretty carefully. We want to build textiles. What is going to happen to automation? How does that affect our ability to create jobs? I visited a textile factory in Mauritius where there were very few human beings, but they were producing world-class textiles. Are we going to be able to do that here? And what does that mean for our job creation aspirations? Secondly, let's think in a distributed network sort of way and make policies that support that. I just worry that centralization and roadmap making may cause us to miss the boat, miss opportunities, may ossify us down a particular path that we may not be able, at least not at great cost, to redirect. Let's make the best use of our creativity, our disobedience, and our decentralization to make this thing happen. happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Aidan. Mr. Msusa.
Now, I think it depends on the orientation, the effectiveness, and capacity of a particular government. I mean, we saw in the 90s, particularly in East Asia, the Chinese and East Asia countries took a different approach. In China, very much state involved, but roping in the private sector over time. And I think they're still trying very hard now to pass on the running of the economy, etc., to the private sector.
At this juncture, I would like to welcome Ms. Bella Bird, Country Director for World Bank, to the stage to deliver a speech on human capacity building and skills development. Please welcome Ms. Bella Bird.
Personally, my view is that this book sets out a very engaging and relevant agenda for Tanzania. It's a very accessible book. I particularly like the way that it brings together the core values of Tanzania's history and culture, including the principles of your first great leader post-independence, Mwalimu Nyerere, with carefully selected international experience and data to set out what is a pragmatic agenda for consideration as Tanzania moves towards industrialization. And I also like the way that the book addresses the challenges Tanzania faces with openness in a spirit of genuinely seeking a pathway that serves the national interest. So I want to congratulate you for that, but also to congratulate you for securing the endorsement of His Excellency President Magufuli, for this book being, and I quote, a vital contribution to the national debate on industrialization. And I think we can all agree that this forward in the book gives its analysis and recommendations considerable added weight in the current dialogue. So to the subject of skills development, I'll start with a few general points on the importance of skills and then respond to some of the points that are set out in the book being launched today. It's very clear that for Tanzania to achieve its industrialization goals, for economic transformation and human development, it will need the right mix and quality of skills in the workforce. No country has achieved such ambitious goals without such investment, as this book makes clear. And the need to upgrade the skills of the workforce in Tanzania are driven by two imperatives. The first one, as we've heard mentioned today, is the need to have the right skills that can support the growth of key economic sectors. The many million young people who will enter the labour market over the next 15 years in Tanzania, and those who have recently joined the labour force, have high aspirations for entering into quality jobs, avoiding poverty, and building a better future for themselves and their families. Current estimates are that around 800,000 young women and men enter the labour force every year in Tanzania. And by 2030, with population growth, this is estimated to be as high as 1.6 million. So, investing in strengthening the skills of these youth will be essential to put Tanzania on a trajectory for development and prosperity that is widely shared. So the book being launched today in the chapter on human capital development describes Tanzania as having a recent education crisis. While I might not go so far as describing it in the same terms, I will argue that despite Tanzania's recent strong growth performance over the past decade or so, possibly the most single important constraint to sustained future growth, economic dynamism, and broad-based human development and economic participation is the limited investment that has been made in Tanzania's human resources. And the data on Tanzania's labour productivity and skills levels shows the extent of the challenge, as the book rightly points out. We've also seen in enterprise skills surveys that around 40% of Tanzanian firms identify the lack of relevant workforce skills as a key business constraint, compared to the sub-Saharan African average of around 23%.
I'll start right away with one of the comments made by Honorable Mpango, and I'll address this to you, Mr. Mfruki. He said he was not convinced that solar power is actually is where our focus should be. However, in this book, it's touched upon as one of the key areas in terms of the way forward for industrialization. Can you expand on why you think solar energy is so critical, and how can we as Tanzanians really move this initiative forward?
I noted that, and I wasn't surprised because this is one of the subjects over which we are going to have to work with the government for a long time. It is a question of mindset. And I'm going to give you an example. The government, if you look at its budget for this year and also the proposed budget for the next few years, is spending or planning to spend about 1 trillion shillings every year, quite a lot of that money coming from our development partners, including the World Bank, on the so-called rural electrification program that in this country is spearheaded by REA, the Rural Energy Agency. That's a lot of money. 1 trillion shillings, that's about almost $500 million. But if you look at the impact for the Tanzanians in the room, who I'm sure have had a village upbringing like me, and once in a while maybe you go back to the village to spend time there, you may have seen the work of this REA, which was started. The people who are using that electricity, they have 2 or 3 bulbs in their homes. Is it really worth it to build an expensive grid at about $1 million per megawatt? And megawatt in brackets, because megawatt needs to be provided. It's not just the infrastructure. And then not deliver the electricity and not have industries happening? Can't we find another way? So we have been proposing throughout the story of writing this book, and I've engaged with quite a lot of scholars, including those who are advising the World Bank, who are advising, I think there's University of California, Berkeley. There's a group there that studies energy and provides policy advice to a lot of people, including our own government, but also to our government here, that you need to understand you cannot take advice on how to move from this situation to a better place from people who survive on building grids. There is a whole industry behind grids. People who make the cables, people who make the generators and the turbines, and people who sell the fuel. If you want to find solutions for rural electrification, you need to speak to people who have no vested interest in this. Do you have the $1 million per megawatt? If we want to move from the current 1,400 to the, I think, 10,000 that this government wants to achieve by 2025, have you done the math to actually understand that we are talking about almost $8.5 billion just for electricity? Where is it going to come from? For distributed solar home kits to actually not only light up a home, but provide energy for electrical appliances that are increasingly growing in number. There is a company that only earlier this year actually launched a solar-powered welding machine. Who would have thought that? A solar-powered welding machine, solar-powered fridges, solar-powered television, solar-powered computer networks are now possible in rural areas and they're uninterrupted because electricity is available all the time. And they cost nothing because the sun is free. And they are environmentally sustainable. 90% of all the energy consumed in this country comes from charcoal and fuel wood. I would like that number to sink in. We are 50 million now. We'll be 70 million in 8 years' time. We'll be 100 million in 2050, 120 million. We are cutting down 370 hectares of forest every single year. That translates to more than 1,000 hectares of forest every single day. This is not sustainable.
Mr. Mtecho, I'll come to you. Putting this into a practical perspective, So as Director General of the National Housing Corporation, and running quite a big program, how does energy impact your organization, the lack thereof or the reliability of energy?
I think this book has helped to give a right voice, a perspective of the private sector to what the government is thinking. And I think for the first time we have at a formal level, professional level, where our ideas can be compared and of course, end of the day, to build so that we can achieve one thing. The whole issue of industrialization that we are talking today needs a lot also of electricity, stability in electricity. This country needs abundant power that is reliable, that is available at the right economic prices, but also in the right geographical locations. We had an issue of a coal recent that came up. I'm not quite sure whether it was a right decision then to ban the coal as source of power, and the cement industry struggled quite a lot. And you would wish that maybe that decision would have been done in stages. You stop the importation or reduce the importation while you are promoting the local coal production without affecting these cement producers. And we are attracting, we are trying to welcome the people to come and invest in this country. But how can you sustainably do that while also the people who have already invested in your country are not protected and are feeling the heat? If you can go and talk to 2 or 3 guys of a cement plant and they are crying because of the power supplies and so forth, how do you think you can easily attract other people? Will it be a government that has to produce the power and generate, or we have to encourage more the private sector? Do we want to learn from the mistakes that we went wrong and use them as a capital, as a school fee that we paid to negotiate better deals, to engage more private sector, instead of now running back and hiding on our own cake?
I would just like to emphasize the fact that we live in very old eras equivalent in terms of the energy we have. We got to do something different. We can't continue in this environment. The city of New York consumes more power than the entire sub-Saharan Africa, and we wonder why we are in this situation. So we got to do something dramatic in order to us to have that step change. I also want to emphasize the fact that energy generation, power generation has never been this democratic. Nowadays, you can generate power from the roof of your house, and while you have power from Tanesco, and we have a meter which is reading, and at the end of the month, it balances. If you generated more from the roof of your house, more than what you use from Tanesco pays you. That happens in several countries today. It's happening. So the era of where you have this centralized, huge power generation centers is going. We have more and more power generation units across distributed power, which is more efficient. So we've got to do something different for us to move from where we are to where we should be.
Do we have questions on energy?
It's not quite a question, but a comment on energy. And I have personal experience in trying to venture into solar-powered energy supply. The challenge we faced, similar to what Ali outlined, is the lack of a clear strategy as to how we will provide electricity to the rural areas. And despite trying to find out from government which areas were not going to be part of the main grid, there was never any sort of definitive document that would tell you that these areas are reserved for other modes of renewable energy. So one day you sort of zone into, we will supply these villages with a mini grid. 3 months later, you see power lines going across. So it becomes a real challenge. Now I understand countries like Rwanda have actually said these areas are available for private investors to invest in renewable energy sources to supply them with electricity. So it's quite clear what the government will do and what the government will not do. And I think that's where we need to get in this country. And I didn't get that feeling from what the minister said, unfortunately. But I think that's where we need to get.
If you were to stop power from TANESCO all of a sudden at 2%, all industry will be ground to a halt. So the weight of that 2% may be lost if one does not disaggregate which power is being. But second point on the PPP, public PPP, which we had gone into without proper preparations, and we have had disasters. Third point is the waste. Ali, you talked about the rural industrialization. One bulb there, another bulb there, another bulb there. Maybe they appear to be a waste now. But the challenge we have is how can we actually engage decentralized development, district level, community level, to be able to do transformation using the power which is already there.
Don't get me wrong, I did not say TANESCO is useless or even RARE is useless. I'm just saying that there is a serious misapplication of resources. Power has to go to where it's needed. TANESCO's power, I would like to see the majority of the 1,400 megawatts that they have go to industries, because we don't really need that expensively generated power just for lighting a bulb. I would say we could do with solar, a million households. A million households. In a few years' time, we would be done with villages. But in the process, we would create a solar industry in this country that would create thousands, if not tens of thousands of jobs. That would provide Tanzania with leadership, because you have a 50 million people market that is going to require this particular resource.
One of the issues mentioned in the book is that we don't have a culture of local savings. And it proposes that we need to be at about 20 to 25% of GDP. Can you elaborate for this audience here today? Why is this necessary, and how can Tanzania actually implement this?
I think what we are proposing and submitting in the book is that the effort to industrialize should go hand with efforts to create the financial availability that will go into financing industrialization. And that comes in many forms and in many means that those finances can be mobilized. Current level of our savings relative to the GDP is like 25%. And our investment relative to the GDP is at the level of around 35%. So we have that gap of 10%, which is financed by foreign capital, which is good in terms of order, FDIs, private equity, venture capital funds, and all that. We should find the means, mechanisms, policies, financial institutions, financial tools that will be able to mobilize financing that is out there, and therefore enhance our capital formation in the process of industrialization.
You are director of a very large investment firm that invests in Tanzania, primarily marketing, 50% of your portfolio, but also throughout Africa on energy. What is it that you look for when you are assessing the investment climate? Can you elaborate that for us, and how can Tanzania actually increase that percentage?
I mean, in terms of foreign direct investment, I think we all know what investors look for in any sort of environment that they're going into. They're looking into an environment that has clear political stability. And by political stability, I mean that there is leadership with a clear vision that is cohesive, coherent, consistent, and predictable. And I think all of those elements then filter into all of the other institutions and frameworks that then come out of that. whether it is the legislative environment, whether it is the application and compliance, be it tax or what have you. All of that, I think, stems through the leadership of it. We need to sort of disabuse ourselves of sort of chasing foreign direct investment as the panacea of all of our problems. I mean, if you look at the sort of horizon that they're talking about of 40 years, there are very few, if any, foreign investors who have a 40-year time investment horizon in a foreign country. So I think we need to recognize that more importantly is how do we get local participation into this. And I would say that there is a lot of resource in country, in a lot of our countries. And if you look at that, I mean, I think if you look at your pension funds, if you look at your insurance companies, if you look at even the commercial banks and banking sector, they all have substantial resources. And it's a question of how do you responsibly but effectively bring those to bear. If you get all the informal actors contributing to your pension fund, that suddenly becomes a very powerful tool of mobilizing capital for future development. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think you've posed quite some interesting comments and questions there. And Mr. Keo, I actually follow up with you because this whole issue of the informal sector at FSDT, you really look at the SME space and how can you work more to bring those SMEs into more formal structures so that actually we can have this impact that Mr. Kigundu is talking about.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like also to extend warm congratulations to the authors of the book. Industrialization is quite pivotal to development. I'm also thrilled to learn that from the book, it starts with the fact that the greatest asset of this nation are its people. In financial inclusion, our greatest asset and target are people. So there's a lot of synergy in this case. And when you look at the aspirations as to why people would engage in any financial intermediation, there are so many reasons. And if they're only to smoothen their consumption patterns or manage shocks, if they do anything is to build their capacities so that they can engage in income generation, and that may mean some form of an enterprise. And therefore, the question of capability comes in, and it's very critical in any development journey. So the way I want to put this or answer the question or put this in context is that we believe that enterprise are the engine of growth in this country, and we talk about it very vehemently every day. I'm not sure whether we give it the deserved priority in terms of giving it the necessary, making sure the necessary conditions actually exist. I believe that for anybody to benefit from anything, there are three conditions. One, being an opportunity that's close to you. Number two is being informed about that opportunity. So the question of information. And the third one that is critical, and I've heard throughout since morning in this room, is the capacity, the capability to be able to take advantage, to turn that opportunity into a real business, into a real benefit. You mentioned the pension funds. It is true, today pension funds can do a lot to support the industrialization journey. But look at the participation in these funds. And I want to expand that to the entire financial intermediation function. You realize that pension funds are saving less than, I think, 3%, and they are targeting formal employed people. We have a workforce of more than 95% that are equally concerned about getting old or not being able to earn an income at some point in their lifetime. And they are part of the social security of the country.
Give us some comments on how NMB are doing that into the future.
Thank you, Santina, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here and discuss this very important topic. The role of commercial banks and financing. We have fantastic ambitions. We have industrialization ambitions, but yes, financing is needed. What is the role of banks in any country? It is to mobilize excess liquidity in a country and be the custodian of that money and turn it around and provide loans to SMEs and to consumers and to businesses. The funding that we have available in Tanzania is predominantly very short-term funding. And therefore, unfortunately, most banks are very limited in turning around the short-term funding and are only able to provide relatively short-term loans, 1 year, 3 years, maximum 5 years. For the industrialization projects that we're talking about, we talk 10 years or 15 years funding. That funding is very, very limited in its availability to banks. We believe that funding is in the country with pension funds, and that funding comes from foreign investors. Now, what is the role that banks can play as an intermediary in attracting the funding from the pension fund or from the foreign investors and turning that around into the industrialization projects? I think there is absolutely an opportunity, and more and more banks are looking at playing the role of investment banker and investment advisory services. So there'll be the intermediary between those type of funding. I also believe that at one point in time, it would be very relevant for the banks, the commercial banks and the pension funds and the government to actually sit around the table and see how we can actually get to the point that more long-term funding that is solely available at the pension fund can actually make it into bankable projects that the banks can actually structure and provide to the industrial sector. There's another element of it, and as commercial banks, we're quite often being challenged by the governor, Professor Dulu, who says, if we look at the money available in the country, and he says, I know exactly how much there is because I print it all. He says 60% of the money available in the country is underneath the mattresses and never reaches a bank account. Now, that is a lot of money. And if we were able to mobilize some of that liquidity underneath the mattresses into the formal financial sector and turn it around and use it for funding of SME enterprises, that would be an enormous opportunity for small business development. So yes, there is a task for banks, and be creative and attract that funding out of the market. It means that we have to be present, and I believe strongly that actually modern technology, internet and mobile banking, makes it possible for financial institutions to reach Tanzanians in sometimes very remote, far away places and provide mobile and internet banking services and mobilize some of that money. But it's not only up to the banks. I think it is partly also policies. It is partly the role of the TRA to some extent. And people need to feel the incentive that, if I put my money on the bank account, I get an adequate return. I read in the book the interesting comment about a bond market, and that in Tanzania we have a bond market, but 99.9% of that is government. So only 0.1% goes to corporates. And we're the lucky issuer at NMB Bank of one of those bonds. And so we issued a 3-year bond at a 13% interest rate.
And I would like to invite Mr. Francis Nanai. He is going to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you all so much for being here.
I feel honored to stand here in front of distinguished guests for this very important event of launching a hallmark, the book which is going to give us a direction what needs to be done in terms of achieving our dream as Tanzanians for industrialization. I'll start by thanking God for affording us an opportunity to be here today. And I think you have enjoyed, you have gained a lot from the different presentations. But also I want to thank, in absentia, His Excellence, the President of the United Republic of Tanzania, Joseph Pombe Magufuli, for penning down the foreword for the book. But also I want to thank the Minister, although they've already left, for gracing the event and launching the book.
the panelists and the keynote speakers. I think they were fabulous and fantastic. We congratulate them for what they've done. Without forgetting the MRGs, that's the authors of the book, Ali Fluki, Moremi, Gilma, and Rahim, for a fantastic, well done job. I want to also thank the sponsors of the book, that is NMB, National Housing Corporation, Exim Bank, Mwananchi Communication Limited, and the DFID. I also want to thank all the invited guests for your time. I know some of you have been here from 7, but until now you are still here, energetic and strong. Let me leave with one last word, a quote from what Magufuli said in the foreword. The book will make a vital contribution to the national debate on how we as a people can work together, public and the private sectors, economic planners, civil servants, educators, researchers, farmers, workers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and ordinary citizens to make Tanzania's industrialization journey a success that can be attained in our lifetime. So I think that's what the President sees as the contribution of this book to our dream. I wish you all the best and enjoy your lunch. Thank you so much.